I never imagined my dream property would become the battleground for the most bizarre property rights showdown in county history. But when Valerie Harrington decided my barn belonged to her, despite property lines, legal documents, and basic human decency saying otherwise, I learned that some people believe boundaries are merely suggestions that don't apply to them. The moment I first drove up the winding gravel road to Sweetwater Farm, I knew I'd found home. After 15 years in the city, the 5-acre property with its 1920s farmhouse and beautifully weathered red barn represented everything I'd been working toward. The realtor had emphasized two key selling points: the property's historic charm and its freedom from HOA restrictions. "You're technically adjacent to Willow Creek Estates," she explained, pointing to the neat row of upscale homes visible through the tree line that marked my eastern boundary. "But your parcel was specifically carved out of the original development. You're under county jurisdiction, not their homeowners association." That independence had been crucial in my decision to purchase. As an artist, I needed the freedom to convert the barn into a studio space without navigating approval committees or architectural review boards. The previous owner had already reinforced the structure and added electricity, giving me the perfect blank canvas for my vision. Over the next 6 months, I poured my heart and savings into transforming the space. I installed north-facing skylights to capture perfect natural light, built custom storage for my canvases and supplies, and created a small gallery area where I could display finished works for potential buyers. The wide plank floors were sanded and sealed, the rough-hewn beams cleaned and preserved. By spring, my studio was featured in a regional arts magazine as a masterful adaptive reuse of agricultural architecture. I was putting the finishing touches on a commissioned landscape when I had my first encounter with Valerie Harrington. The Saturday farmers market had become my weekly ritual, a place to connect with neighbors and source local ingredients. I was examining heirloom tomatoes when a voice beside me asked, "You're Morgan Bailey, aren't you? The artist who bought old Sweetwater Farm?" I turned to find a woman in her early 60s, impeccably dressed in linen pants and a silk blouse despite the casual setting. Her smile was practiced, her handshake firm and slightly too long. "Valerie Harrington," she introduced herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being recognized. "Willow Creek HOA president. I've been meaning to welcome you to the..." "Harrier?" "Thank you," I replied, disengaging my hand politely. "Though technically I'm not part of Willow Creek." Something flickered briefly across her face, annoyance perhaps, before her smile reasserted itself. Of course. Still, we're practically neighbors. I must say you've done wonderful things with that old barn. My daughter Amanda is getting married next summer, and I was just telling her what a perfect rustic wedding venue it would make." The comment caught me off guard. "Oh, it's not a venue. It's my studio." "But surely you don't use all that space every day," she pressed, as if my correction had been an opening for negotiation. "Amanda's always dreamed of a barn wedding, and yours has such character. We'd be happy to compensate you, of course." "I appreciate the interest," I said firmly, "but the barn isn't available for events. The renovation was specifically designed for my art practice." Valerie's smile remained fixed, but her eyes cooled noticeably. "Well, think about it. Amanda's wedding is still 8 months away, plenty of time to reconsider." She drifted away with her market basket, leaving me with an unsettled feeling I couldn't quite place. At the time, I dismissed it as simple presumption, an entitled neighbor assuming my property would be available for her purposes. Later, as I paid for my produce, the farmer leaned across his table conspiratorially. "I see you met Queen Valerie, is that what people call her?" he chuckled. "Among other things. Watch yourself. She's used to getting her way in Willow Creek. Treats those HOA rules like her personal kingdom." "Thankfully, I'm outside her jurisdiction," I replied. His expression turned doubtful. "Lines on maps don't mean much to Valerie. When she wants something." I should have heeded his warning more carefully. Instead, I drove home, admiring the late summer light filtering through the maple trees lining my driveway, looking forward to capturing that particular gold-green glow in my next painting. The week passed in a productive blur of creative work. I was cleaning brushes late Friday afternoon when movement outside caught my eye. A luxury SUV was driving slowly past my property, passenger window lowered as someone took photos of my barn. The vehicle continued down the road before I could identify the occupants, but the encounter left me feeling exposed in a way I hadn't before. My rural paradise had always represented privacy and creative freedom. Now, for the first time, I wondered if those values were more vulnerable than the property lines suggested. That evening, I reviewed my closing documents, confirming what I already knew. Sweetwater Farm was unquestionably outside Willow Creek Estate's boundaries. The plat map clearly showed my 5 acres as a separate parcel under county jurisdiction, not subject to any homeowners association covenants or restrictions. I told myself I was being paranoid. One presumptuous conversation and an unknown photographer didn't constitute a threat. Valerie Harrington might be accustomed to controlling her HOA domain, but surely she understood basic property rights. As it turned out, I had dramatically underestimated what happens when entitled privilege collides with the word no. Valerie didn't see my barn as my private property. She saw it as an underutilized resource that should be available for her daughter's perfect wedding day. Hand in her world what Valerie wanted, Valerie got. I didn't know it yet, but that casual farmers market conversation was just the opening salvo in a conflict that would ultimately lead to me standing guard over my own barn, while an enraged HOA president, a sobbing bride, and dozens of confused wedding guests demanded I unlock the doors to my private property. Sometimes paradise needs to be defended. I just never expected I'd have to defend mine from a wedding-obsessed HOA Karen who believed my barn belonged to her, simply because she wanted it. The first text message arrived 3 days after our farmers market encounter. "Good morning, Valerie. Harrington here. Would love to bring Amanda by to see the barn space this week. What day works for you?" I stared at my phone, momentarily confused. Had I somehow given the impression that my firm no was actually a maybe? I crafted a polite but clear response. "Hi, Valerie. As I mentioned, my barn isn't available as an event space. It's my private art studio and not set up for visitors. Best of luck finding a suitable venue for Amanda." Her reply came almost instantly. "We won't be any trouble, just a quick peek. How about Thursday at 3? This strange disconnect where my explicit refusal was treated as if I'd never expressed it became the defining pattern of my interactions with Valerie Harrington. The following week, I was unloading groceries when a sleek white Range Rover pulled into my driveway. Valerie emerged, waving as if we had a scheduled appointment. "Morgan, hope this isn't a bad time. I was just passing by and thought, why not see if you're available?" Before I could respond, a young woman stepped out of the passenger side. Presumably, Amanda, though the family resemblance was limited to the same sense of entitled confidence. "We'll only take a minute of your time," Valerie continued, already walking toward the barn. "Amanda's been dying to see the space since I told her about it." I set down my grocery bags, intercepting them halfway across the yard. "Valerie, I've been clear that the barn isn't available. This is my private studio, not a venue for rent." Amanda at least had the grace to look embarrassed, but Valerie merely smiled as if I'd said something charming. "Oh, we understand it's your workspace. We just want to get a sense of the dimensions for planning purposes." "Planning purposes?" I echoed, incredulous. "There's nothing to plan. I'm not hosting a wedding in my studio." Valerie patted my arm condescendingly. "Everyone says that at first, but once you hear our vision..." 10 uncomfortable minutes later, I finally managed to usher them back to their vehicle without allowing access to the barn. As they drove away, I noticed Amanda looking back with obvious disappointment. Despite my frustration, I felt a twinge of sympathy for her. It was becoming clear that Valerie was the driving force behind this wedding barn fixation. The incident left me unsettled enough to call my nearest neighbor, an elderly gentleman named Frank, who had lived adjacent to Sweetwater Farm for over 30 years. "Oh, you've met the Harrington Hurricane," he chuckled when I described the situation. "Valerie's been running Willow Creek like her personal fiefdom since they built those houses 10 years ago. Gets what she wants by wearing people down. She seems to have trouble understanding the word no," I observed. "More like she doesn't believe it applies to her," Frank replied. "Last year, she decided the community needed a new entrance fountain. When the HOA board voted it down, she had construction start anyway. By the time anyone realized, the old sign was demolished, and they had no choice but to continue. His warning echoed in my mind 3 days later when I returned from an art supply run to find a white van parked in my driveway. The side read, "Memorable. Moments event planning." I found Valerie in my yard with a professionally dressed woman carrying a tablet, both staring up at my barn while discussing lighting options. "Valerie," I called out, not bothering to hide my irritation, "this is trespassing. You need to leave." She turned, beaming as if I'd just offered her tea. "Morgan, perfect timing. This is Denise, the best wedding planner in the county. We were just discussing the potential fairy light configuration." "There won't be any fairy lights because there won't be any wedding," I stated firmly. "Please leave my property immediately." The wedding planner, at least, seemed to grasp the situation. She glanced between us awkwardly. "I'm sorry. I was told this venue was confirmed." "It's not a venue, it's my private studio, and it was never confirmed," I clarified. "Valerie does not have permission to be here, let alone plan an event." Denise mumbled apologies and quickly retreated to her van. Valerie, however, showed no such awareness. "You're being very difficult," she said, her pleasant mask slipping. "Amanda has her heart set on this space. Name your price. Everyone has one." "This isn't about money," I explained for what felt like the dozenth time. "This is my creative workspace. It's not for rent at any price." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You know, I've been doing some research. There's some question about whether your property actually falls under Willow Creek's covenants. The original development plans included this parcel. The implied threat was clear." "My deed and the county records are unambiguous," I replied. "Sweetwater Farm is not part of your HOA. Now please leave before I call the sheriff." As she drove away, I realized I needed to take the situation more seriously. That evening, I spent hours researching property records, confirming without any doubt that my land was legally separate from Willow Creek Estates. I also discovered that Valerie had attempted similar boundary reinterpretations with 2 other adjacent properties in recent years. My concerns deepened the following week when I returned from a gallery meeting to find a glossy brochure in my mailbox, Willow Creek Community Newsletter. Inside was a feature about upcoming events, including a prominent mention of Amanda Harrington's summer wedding at the historic Sweetwater Barn. I immediately emailed the newsletter contact listed, demanding a retraction. The reply came from Valerie's personal email. "The newsletter committee felt it important to highlight community events. As the barn is visible from Willow Creek and affects our scenic views, we consider it a community interest property." The next escalation came in the form of a formal letter on Willow Creek HOA letterhead, delivered by courier. The document, signed by Valerie as HOA president, purported to grant approval for the temporary use variance of my barn for Amanda's wedding, scheduled for June 15th, a date I was learning about for the first time. The letter included conditions, such as returning the barn to aesthetic compliance within 72 hours after the event and not allowing amplified music after 10 p.m. The sheer audacity left me speechless. Valerie wasn't just ignoring my refusals, she was creating an elaborate fiction where she had authority over my property and had granted permission to herself. I was drafting a strongly worded response when my phone rang, a local number I didn't recognize. "Is this Morgan Bailey? I'm calling about the barn wedding venue rental." "My barn is not a wedding venue," I replied automatically. "Oh," the caller sounded confused. "But you're listed as the contact for the Sweetwater Farm barn in Amanda Harrington's wedding invitation." A cold feeling settled in my stomach. Her invitations have already gone out, with my property listed as the venue. "Yes, we received ours yesterday. It says ceremony and reception at the historic Sweetwater Barn, with your address. There's no phone number, but your email is listed for questions." After ending the call, I stood in my kitchen, staring out at the barn that had become the focus of this bizarre conflict. What had begun as a presumptuous request had escalated into an elaborate fantasy, where my explicit refusals were simply ignored and rewritten into approval. It was becoming clear that standard communication wasn't working. Valerie Harrington wasn't hearing no because she had decided that my property, my time and my consent were less important than her daughter's wedding plans. Each escalation had been met with polite but firm boundaries, yet the situation was worsening. As the sun set behind my barn, casting long shadows across the property I had worked so hard to create as my personal sanctuary, I realized I needed to change tactics. Politeness hadn't worked. Clear communication hadn't worked. The time had come for more formal boundaries, legal ones that even Valerie Harrington couldn't reinterpret to suit her narrative. Little did I know that even legal boundaries would prove insufficient against the determination of an HOA president who believed my barn belonged in her jurisdiction simply because she could see it from her community. The morning after discovering my barn had been listed on wedding invitations without my consent, I met with Robert Chen, a local attorney specializing in property disputes. His office walls displayed aerial photos of county properties with boundary lines superimposed, a visual testament to his expertise. "This is among the more unusual cases I've encountered," he admitted, reviewing my documentation. "Usually, HOA overreach involves actual HOA properties, not neighboring parcels." "So I'm right? My property is definitively outside their jurisdiction?" He nodded, pointing to county plat maps on his computer. "Without question, Sweetwater Farm was specifically excluded from Willow Creek's development plan. There's no legal ambiguity." Armed with this confirmation, I drafted a formal cease and desist letter with Robert's guidance. The document explicitly prohibited Valerie or any Willow Creek representatives from entering my property, planning events on my property, or representing my barn as a wedding venue. It clarified the legal boundaries and specified that any further trespassing would result in legal action. The letter was delivered by courier with signature confirmation. Valerie's response came 3 days later, not to me directly, but in the form of a violation notice taped to my mailbox. Notice of covenant violation, it read in bold red letters. Property, Sweetwater Farm. Violation, unauthorized commercial. Activity, art studio in residential zone. Fine, 250 day until resolved. The document cited HOA bylaws that had no legal authority over my property, yet it was crafted to appear official and threatening. I added it to my growing file of evidence. The next day brought 2 more notices, one claiming my restored barn was an aesthetic non-compliance issue and another declaring my studio skylights unapproved modifications to historic structure. Each carried escalating fine amounts. "She's trying to bury you in paperwork and intimidation," Robert explained when I forwarded the notices. "Classic harassment tactic. Create enough trouble that capitulating seems easier than fighting." When bogus HOA notices failed to intimidate me, Valerie escalated to county authorities. A building inspector appeared at my door the following week, apologetically explaining that they'd received multiple complaints about unauthorized commercial activities and unpermitted structural modifications to the barn. I walked him through the property, showing permits and documentation for all renovations. He quickly confirmed everything was in compliance. "Between us," he said as he prepared to leave, "this isn't the first time we've received complaints about properties bordering Willow Creek, always the same handwriting on the forms. Word of the dispute spread through both communities. Neighbors began taking sides, some expressing sympathy for my position, others questioning why I wouldn't just help out a bride's special day. The narrative Valerie promoted painted me as unreasonably stubborn, while conveniently omitting her trespassing and harassment. Lisa Martinez, whose property also bordered Willow Creek, stopped by with a warning. When Valerie targeted my garden shed last year, she organized a community workday where volunteers helped by repainting it HOA-approved colors while I was at work. I came home to find 10 people on my property with paint rollers. Her story convinced me to install security, cameras covering the barn and access points to my property. The investment proved justified almost immediately when the system alerted me to motion near the barn while I was attending a gallery opening 30 miles away. The footage showed Valerie leading 3 women, presumably wedding vendors, on a tour around my barn's exterior. She tried the doors, peered through windows, and at one point produced a measuring tape to check dimensions between support posts. When confronted with this evidence via email, Valerie's response was breathtaking in its entitlement. I was simply helping Amanda's florist understand the space requirements. Since you've been uncooperative about providing access, we had to make do with exterior measurements. The boundary dispute took an alarming turn when I discovered survey stakes had been moved along my eastern property line, the boundary shared with Willow Creek. The stakes had been shifted approximately 8 feet onto my property, which would conveniently place a portion of the barn's access area within Willow Creek's territory if the altered boundaries were accepted. County records confirmed my original boundary markers were correct. When I reinstalled proper stakes with bright orange markers, they were removed overnight. The next day I installed concrete markers that couldn't be easily moved, along with signs clearly stating private property, no trespassing, and not part of Willow Creek Estates. Valerie's response was to file a boundary dispute with the county surveyor's office, claiming historical documentation suggested different property lines than those currently recorded. This forced me to hire a professional surveyor at considerable expense to reconfirm boundaries that were already clearly established in county records. "She's hoping you'll get tired of spending money defending your property," Robert observed when I updated him. "It's a war of attrition." The breaking point came when wedding invitations began circulating more widely in the community. A kindly postal worker, who delivered to both my property and Willow Creek, brought me a copy that had been returned for insufficient postage. The elegant card featured a watercolor illustration of my barn with fairy lights and floral arrangements. "Amanda Harrington and Justin Powell request the honor of your presence," it read, listing Sweetwater Farm Barn as the venue with my address clearly printed. Most infuriatingly, it included the line, "With special thanks to Morgan Bailey for generously hosting our celebration." I photographed the invitation and forwarded it to Robert, who agreed it constituted significant evidence of misrepresentation. "This crosses the line from harassment to potential fraud," he noted. "She's making representations about your property and implying your consent where none exists." With Robert's guidance, I filed for a temporary restraining order against Valerie, citing the pattern of harassment, trespassing, boundary tampering, and misrepresentation. The court date was set for the following week, unfortunately still 3 weeks before the planned wedding date. Meanwhile, I discovered Valerie had somehow obtained a set of spare keys to my barn. The security footage showed her testing them, unsuccessfully on the main doors after her most recent trespassing incident. I immediately contacted a locksmith to replace all external locks on both my house and barn. "Previous owners must have provided a set to neighbors for emergencies," the locksmith suggested as he installed new deadbolts. "Happens all the time in rural areas." "These aren't just neighbors," I explained, watching him work. "They're trying to take over my barn for an event I've repeatedly refused to host." He paused, giving me a curious look. "Wait, is this about that Willow Creek wedding? My cousin's girlfriend got an invitation to that. Says it's happening here." "It's not," I stated firmly. "That's the problem." As he finished installing the new locks, I received an email notification that made my blood run cold. The subject line read, "Sweetwater Barn Wedding, Vendor Delivery Schedule." The email, sent to multiple vendors with me, merely copied, outlined, a detailed timeline for wedding setup beginning at 7 a.m. on June 15th, just 10 days away. It included delivery schedules for tables, chairs, floral arrangements, catering equipment, and a dance floor. As discussed with the venue owner, Valerie had written, all items must be removed by noon the following day. I stared at my screen, astounded by the sheer audacity. Despite multiple refusals, legal warnings, cease and desist letters, trespassing documentation, and boundary disputes, Valerie was proceeding as if my barn was definitively booked for her daughter's wedding. That evening, while checking the new locks, I found something that pushed the situation from absurd to truly alarming. Wedding decorations were already being stored in my barn's side shed, an area I rarely used that had apparently been accessed during one of Valerie's unauthorized visits. Boxes, labeled Amanda's Wedding, contained centerpieces, table numbers, and personalized signage for a celebration that I had repeatedly refused to host. The invasion felt deeply personal, not just of my property boundaries, but of my sense of security and autonomy. As I documented this latest trespass for my attorney, I realized I was approaching a decision point. The restraining order hearing was still days away. The wedding was apparently proceeding regardless of my consent. If Valerie was willing to enter my property and store items without permission, what would stop her from simply arriving with vendors and guests on the appointed day? I needed a plan for what was increasingly looking like an inevitable confrontation, one that would protect my property rights without creating unnecessary drama. But how do you reason with someone who has spent months demonstrating that your explicit refusals mean nothing? The answer, as it turned out, would involve a strategic application of new padlocks and a willingness to stand my ground against not just Valerie, but an entire wedding party convinced they had legitimate access to my privately owned barn. The discovery of wedding decorations in my barn shed marked a disturbing escalation. This wasn't just trespassing. It was Valerie staking a claim, physically occupying my space despite every boundary I'd established. I documented everything, photographing each box and its contents before carefully placing them on my front porch, with a note requesting their removal. By morning, the boxes had disappeared, but no acknowledgement came from Valerie. My restraining order hearing was still 5 days away, with the wedding scheduled for the weekend after. The timing created a dangerous window where legal protection hadn't yet been established, but Valerie's plans were clearly advancing. "We need to consider additional security measures," Robert advised during our prep call. "The temporary restraining order should be granted based on your evidence, but enforcement in a rural area could be challenging." I upgraded my security system with additional cameras and motion-triggered floodlights. The locksmith returned to install heavy-duty padlocks on all barn entrances, ones that couldn't be picked or easily cut without serious tools. These precautions proved immediately necessary. The next evening, my security alerts pinged repeatedly as a small group conducted what appeared to be a wedding rehearsal on my property. The footage showed Valerie directing people through a mock ceremony outside, the barn measuring distances and marking positions with small flags. When I confronted them from my porch, Valerie waved dismissively. "We're just getting preliminary measurements," she called back, as if this explained their presence on my private property. "We'll be out of your way shortly." "You're trespassing," I stated firmly. "Leave now or I'm calling the sheriff." She smiled, with infuriating condescension. "Morgan, this continued resistance is becoming embarrassing. The wedding is happening. Vendors are contracted. Guests are traveling from out of state. You need to accept reality." "The reality is that this is my private property, and I've never given permission for any event. Actually," she countered, pulling papers from a portfolio, "we have documentation that Sweetwater Farm was included in the original Willow Creek community plans. The developer's intent was clear. Your property falls under HOA purview. I'd had enough." "Sheriff's Department, please," I said into my phone, maintaining eye contact with Valerie. The group departed before officers arrived, but the incident left me deeply unsettled. Valerie's confidence suggested she genuinely believed she would prevail, either through legal technicalities or simply by creating a situation where stopping the wedding would seem more disruptive than allowing it. The breaking point came 3 days before my restraining order hearing, when I returned from a necessary gallery appointment to find a locksmith van parked in my driveway. A man in uniform was examining my barn's main doors while Valerie watched from a few feet away. My security system had alerted me to their presence, but I'd been 40 minutes away and had to rush back. "What exactly is happening here?" I demanded, approaching rapidly. The locksmith looked between us uncomfortably. "I was called to replace locks to match existing keys," he explained, gesturing to Valerie. "The lady said the new locks were installed without proper authorization. I'm the property owner," I stated, producing identification. "This woman has no authority here. She's trespassing and apparently attempting to gain unauthorized access to my barn." Valerie's composure never wavered. As I was explaining to this gentleman, Sweetwater Farm falls within Willow Creek's architectural oversight jurisdiction. The HOA has documentation. Those documents are fabricated, I interrupted, turning to the confused locksmith. This property is not part of any HOA. I have county records confirming this. The locksmith wisely decided to remove himself from the situation. I can't get involved in a property dispute. You folks need to sort this out before I can do any work. After he departed, Valerie and I stood facing each other in what felt like the culmination of months of escalating boundary violations. This has gone far enough, I said, struggling to maintain composure. You've trespassed repeatedly. You've misrepresented my property as a wedding venue. You've stored items in my barn without permission. Now you're attempting to change my locks. This is criminal behavior. What's criminal is your obstinate refusal to help a young couple on their wedding day, she replied. The community is appalled by your selfishness. This isn't about selfishness. It's about basic property rights and consent. My barn is not available. It has never been available. It will not be available on June 15th or any other date. Her expression hardened. Let me be absolutely clear, Morgan. Amanda's wedding will take place in this barn on June 15th. We have 87 guests, some flying in from Europe. We have vendors contracted with non-refundable deposits. We have no alternative venue available on short notice. None of that is my problem, I replied. Your poor planning and delusion don't create an obligation on my part. It's happening, she stated with chilling certainty, with or without your cooperation. Are you threatening me? I'm informing you of inevitable facts. On June 15th, Amanda will have her dream barn wedding. The only question is whether you'll be remembered as the neighbor who graciously helped or the one who needlessly created a humiliating scene. As she turned to leave, she added, The community has a long memory, Morgan. This isn't just about one day. It's about where you'll stand in Willow Creek for years to come. After she drove away, I stood in my driveway, shaking with a combination of anger and disbelief. The entitlement was so profound it defied comprehension, as if my property rights simply dissolved in the face of her daughter's wedding desires. Called Robert immediately. We need to move up the restraining order hearing if possible. Valerie just tried to have my locks changed to gain access to the barn. I'll file for an emergency hearing, he promised. But realistically, even with expedited processing, we're still looking at several days. That evening, I received an email that confirmed my worst fears, a final vendor confirmation for Sweetwater Barn Wedding on June 15th, listing an 8:1 a.m. setup start time just 3 days away. The breaking point had arrived. If the law couldn't protect my property in time, I would need to take matters into my own hands, legally but decisively. I spent that night researching my options and developing a plan that would protect my property without creating legal liability. By morning, I knew exactly what I needed to do when the wedding party inevitably arrived. The battle for my barn was coming to a head, and I was finally ready. On June 15th, I woke before dawn. Sleep had been elusive, my mind cycling through worst-case scenarios and contingency plans. At 5:30 a.m., I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, laptop open to my security camera feeds, watching for the inevitable arrival. I didn't have to wait long. At 6:17 a.m., a white van with Premier Event Rentals emblazoned on the side turned onto my gravel driveway. It was followed by 3 more vehicles, a florist's delivery truck, a catering van, and Valerie's now familiar Range Rover. My phone rang almost immediately, a number I didn't recognize. Morgan, this is Denise from Memorable Moments Event Planning. We're arriving for setup and the gate at the end of your drive is locked. Yes, I confirmed calmly, because I haven't authorized any event on my property. A brief silence followed. But the wedding is today. We have a full setup schedule approved by Mrs. Harrington. Mrs. Harrington doesn't own this property and has no authority to approve anything here. I've repeatedly informed her that my barn is not available for her daughter's wedding. Another pause. I need to speak with Mrs. Harrington. There. Seems to be a serious misunderstanding. Through my security feed, I watched Denise approach Valerie's vehicle. Their conversation appeared animated, with Denise gesturing toward the house while Valerie shook her head emphatically. Minutes later, Valerie marched up to my front porch and pounded on the door. I opened it, keeping the security chain engaged. "Open this gate immediately," she demanded. "You're causing a significant disruption to a carefully planned event." "Valerie, I've been explicitly clear for months that my property is not available for any event. There is no misunderstanding here, just your continued disregard for my property rights. We have contracts with vendors, guests arriving in hours. I have explained that the barn is secured for today. You've misrepresented my property without consent. That's your responsibility to resolve, not mine." Her expression shifted from anger to bargaining. "Name your price, whatever you want, it's yours. Just let us use the barn for today." "This isn't about money," I replied firmly. "It's about boundaries and respect, neither of which you've demonstrated." Our standoff was interrupted by Denise, approaching cautiously. "Mrs. Harrington, we need direction. Vendors are waiting and we're burning setup time." Valerie turned to her with renewed confidence. "Morgan is just negotiating. Tell everyone to wait by the barn. We'll have access momentarily." After they retreated down the driveway, I called Robert. "They're here with multiple vehicles. Valerie is telling vendors they'll have access momentarily, despite my explicit refusal." "Document everything," he advised. "If they attempt to force entry, call the sheriff immediately. Remember, you have no obligation to accommodate them in any way." Through my security cameras, I watched an increasingly chaotic scene unfold. More vehicles arrived, a DJ with sound equipment, photographers, hair and makeup artists. The vendors clustered uncertainly near my locked barn, while Valerie maintained an appearance of control, periodically checking her watch and assuring everyone that setup would begin any minute now. At 8:30 a.m., Valerie approached my house again, this time with a man I assumed was her husband, tall, silver-haired, with the confident bearing of someone unaccustomed to obstacles. "Morgan," he began without introduction, "I'm Richard Harrington. I understand there's been some miscommunication about today's arrangements." "There's been no miscommunication," I corrected him. "I've consistently refused permission for any event on my property. Your wife has chosen to ignore my refusals." Richard's practiced smile never wavered. "Surely we can resolve this reasonably. We are prepared to offer substantial compensation for today's inconvenience." "This isn't an inconvenience, it's trespassing. Multiple vehicles are currently on my property without permission." His expression hardened slightly. "The financial impact of cancellation would be extreme. Many guests have already traveled considerable distances. I sympathize with your guests, but this situation is entirely of Valerie's creation. I've been clear and consistent for months." Richard leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Listen carefully. This wedding is happening today. One way or another, we will access that barn. You can make this easy or difficult. Your choice." The threat was unmistakable. I closed my door and immediately called the sheriff's department. "I have multiple individuals trespassing on my property, attempting to set up an unauthorized event, and now making threatening statements about forcing access to my barn." The dispatcher took my information, but warned me. "Deputies are handling a multi-vehicle accident on the highway. Response time to your location could be 1 to 2 hours. 9:30 a.m., the situation had escalated further. Approximately 20 people now crowded my driveway, vendors, wedding party members, and early arriving guests. Through my security feeds, I saw Valerie leading her daughter Amanda around the property, pointing out where different wedding elements would be placed as if my continued refusal was merely a temporary inconvenience. Amanda looked uncomfortable, glancing repeatedly toward my house. Unlike her mother, she seemed to recognize the inappropriate nature of their presence. At 10:15 a.m., I spotted Richard examining my barn doors, running his hands along the frame and hinges. He then walked to his car and returned with what appeared to be bolt cutters partially concealed under his jacket. The moment of decision had arrived. Deputies were still at least an hour away. Vendors were unpacking equipment. Guests continued arriving. Richard was clearly preparing to forcibly access my barn. I had anticipated this possibility. My contingency plan was ready. I needed to act, now decisively but legally, to protect my property rights before the situation spiraled completely out of control. With one final glance at my security feeds, I gathered what I needed and prepared to execute the plan I had carefully developed. Over sleepless nights. This wasn't how I had imagined spending my Saturday, but Valerie had left me no choice but to take a stand that even she couldn't ignore. The showdown for my barn had reached its critical moment, and I was determined that property rights would prevail over even the most elaborate wedding fantasy. I watched through my security feed as Richard examined my barn doors, bolt cutters in hand. He consulted briefly with Valerie, who nodded emphatically while gesturing toward the main entrance. They were moments away from destroying my property to gain unauthorized access. It was time to implement my plan. I slipped out my back door, circling through the small wooded area that shielded the rear of my property from view. Years working in studio settings had taught me to move silently with art supplies. Now those skills served a different purpose as I navigated toward the back entrance of my barn undetected. My timing was perfect. The wedding party's attention was focused on the main doors, where Richard was preparing his assault on my locks. Meanwhile, the caterers had unloaded their van and were waiting for access, their refrigerated items increasingly at risk in the June heat. This had created exactly the distraction I needed. I reached the barn's rear entrance and quickly unlocked the door with my key. Inside, the space remained exactly as I had left it, my art studio, my private creative sanctuary, not a wedding venue. I moved swiftly through the familiar space toward my goal, the interior security panel I had installed after finding wedding decorations in my shed. Outside, I could hear Valerie's voice growing louder. "Just cut it already, Richard. We're running out of time." I activated the security system's new features, triggering the heavy-duty interior deadbolts I had installed on all exterior doors. These weren't standard locks that could be cut with bolt cutters. They were recessed steel mechanisms designed specifically to prevent forced entry. Next, I pulled the 4 new industrial-grade padlocks from my bag. These were serious security devices, hardened steel with complex locking mechanisms that even professional bolt cutters would struggle with. I secured each interior door brace, effectively creating redundant security that would make accessing the barn nearly impossible without causing major structural damage. The sound of metal striking metal outside told me Richard had begun his attempt on the exterior locks. His efforts would be futile now that the interior systems were engaged. I quickly moved to the loft area, with its small window overlooking the main entrance. From this vantage point, I could observe the entire scene while remaining mostly hidden. Richard was struggling with the exterior padlock, the bolt cutters proving inadequate against the hardened steel. Valerie paced behind him, periodically checking her watch and snapping directions at increasingly anxious vendors. The wedding planner, Denise, appeared to be having an intense phone conversation, her expression conveying mounting distress. I took out my phone and began recording video, narrating quietly. "This is Morgan Bailey, owner of Sweetwater Farm. It is 10:37 a.m. on June 15th. These individuals are attempting to forcibly access my barn after multiple written and verbal notifications that my property is not available for their event. I have locked down the building to protect my property from unauthorized entry." A shout of frustration from Richard indicated he had discovered the futility of his efforts. The exterior lock remained intact despite his attempts. Now came the most critical phase of my plan. I moved back through the barn, exiting through the rear door and relocking it behind me. Then I circled around to approach my property from the front, as if I had just returned from an errand. The assembled group turned as I walked calmly up my own driveway. Their expressions ranged from shock to embarrassment to outright hostility. "What do you think you're doing?" I called out, phone continuing to record. "Why are there dozens of people on my private property?" Valerie stepped forward, momentarily, flustered by my direct approach. "Morgan, stop this ridiculous game. You know perfectly well Amanda's wedding is scheduled here today." "I have repeatedly informed you that my property is not available for any event," I replied evenly. "Every person here is trespassing after multiple notices to the contrary." I turned to address the gathered vendors and guests directly. "I apologize for any confusion, but I have never authorized a wedding or any event on my property. I have documentation of multiple written refusals sent to Valerie Harrington over the past 6 months. Murmurs spread through the crowd as people processed this information. Several guests looked distinctly uncomfortable, glancing between Valerie and me with growing uncertainty. Richard approached, no longer bothering to conceal the bolt cutters. "We need access to the barn immediately. Guests are arriving, and we have perishable items that need refrigeration." "I understand your frustration," I replied, "but this situation is not of my creation. I've been explicitly clear that my barn is not available." "Open these doors now," Valerie demanded, her composed facade crumbling. "You have no right to lock us out." "Actually, I have every right to secure my private property against unauthorized access," I countered, gesturing to the no trespassing signs I had prominently posted. "And I have video documentation of your husband attempting to cut my locks, which constitutes attempted breaking and entering." As if on cue, a white limousine pulled into my driveway. The bride had arrived. Amanda emerged looking radiant in a simple white dress, her expression shifting from joyful anticipation to confusion as she surveyed the tense standoff. "Mom, what's happening? Why is everyone just standing around?" Valerie rushed to her daughter, attempting damage control. "Just a small misunderstanding about access, sweetheart. Morgan is being difficult about the locks, but Daddy will sort it out." Amanda's gaze met mine, and I saw a flash of comprehension. "This is the barn you said was confirmed? The one where the owner supposedly agreed months ago?" The question hung in the air, Valerie momentarily speechless. "I have never agreed to host any event here," I stated clearly, addressing Amanda directly. "I'm very sorry that you were misled, but your mother has repeatedly ignored my explicit refusals." Amanda turned to her mother, comprehension dawning. "Mom, is this true? Did you plan my entire wedding at a location that never actually agreed to host us?" Before Valerie could construct a response, the wedding planner approached with visible anxiety. "Mrs. Harrington, we have over 60 guests arriving within the hour. If we can't access this venue, we need to implement emergency contingency measures immediately." "There is no contingency plan," Valerie snapped. "This is the venue." I remained calm but firm. "No, it isn't. It never was, and now I need everyone to vacate my property immediately. The sheriff's department has been called and is en route." As the reality of the situation finally began to penetrate, chaos erupted among the wedding party. Vendors began frantically calling contacts seeking alternative spaces. Guests looked to each other in confusion, and at the center of it all, a bride whose perfect day was collapsing because her mother had built it on a foundation of entitlement and delusion. I almost felt sorry for Amanda. Almost. The minutes following my lockdown announcement descended into controlled chaos. Vendors huddled with the increasingly frantic wedding planner, guests whispered among themselves, and Amanda confronted her mother with growing distress. Through it all, I maintained my position at the edge of my driveway, phone still recording, a quiet sentinel to the unfolding drama. Richard Harrington approached me first, his initial intimidation tactics replaced with frustrated negotiation. "Look, I understand there's been a misunderstanding," he began, his voice lowered, "but we have a real situation here. 80 guests, some who've traveled internationally, thousands in non-refundable deposits. There must be a solution." "I sympathize with your position," I replied, genuinely meaning it. "But this misunderstanding has been actively cultivated by Valerie, despite months of clear communication from me. I've consistently refused permission for any event here." Before Richard could respond, Valerie inserted herself between us, her composed facade completely abandoned. "You will unlock that barn immediately," she demanded, finger jabbing toward my chest. "Do you have any idea who we are in this community? The connections we have? You'll never sell another painting in this county." "Are you threatening me?" I asked calmly, making sure my phone captured her words. "I'm stating facts," she hissed. "When I'm finished, you'll wish you'd never bought this property." Richard pulled her back gently. "Val, this isn't helping. I noticed several HOA board members had arrived and were approaching our confrontation. Harold Freeman, who I recognized as Willow Creek's vice president, looked deeply uncomfortable. "Valerie, what exactly is happening here?" he asked. "You told the board this venue was confirmed months ago." "It was confirmed," she insisted. "Morgan is being difficult for no reason other than spite." I addressed Harold directly. I have documentation of at least 17 separate occasions where I explicitly refused permission for any event on my property, including certified letters from my attorney. Valerie has trespassed repeatedly, attempted to change my locks, and now her husband tried to cut through my security measures with bolt cutters. Harold's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. "Richard, is that true?" Richard at least had the decency to look embarrassed. The situation became complicated. The board needs to intervene, Harold decided, turning to the other members who had gathered. "This is becoming a legal liability for the entire HOA." Valerie's face flushed crimson. "The board has no authority here. This is my daughter's wedding. On property that is not yours, was never offered to you, and where you are currently trespassing," I interjected calmly. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, if not for Amanda's unexpected intervention. She approached our group, her wedding dress gathering dust from my gravel driveway, her expression a complex mixture of embarrassment and resolve. "Mom, this has gone far enough," she said quietly. "You told me everything was arranged properly, that Morgan had enthusiastically agreed to host us." "She changed her mind," Valerie insisted desperately. "She's being vindictive." Amanda turned to me directly. "Has my mother ever had your permission to use your barn?" "No," I answered honestly. "I've refused consistently since her first request at the farmer's market last fall." Amanda closed her eyes briefly, processing this confirmation of what she clearly had already suspected. "Mom, we need to leave now. This is humiliating for everyone." "We are not leaving." Valerie's voice rose sharply. "I've spent months planning this perfect day. Everything is here, the caterers, the flowers, the photographer." "On property where they have no permission to be," Harold reminded her gently. The situation reached a new level of tension when 3 more vehicles pulled into my already crowded driveway. Richard's brothers, as I would later learn. Large men with determined expressions, they approached our group with purposeful strides. "What's the hold-up, Rich?" the tallest one asked, eyeing me with obvious suspicion. "Need some help convincing the artist to cooperate?" The implied threat hung in the air. I took a deliberate step backward, maintaining eye contact while continuing to record. "If anyone attempts to force entry to my barn or threaten me physically, I'll press charges for breaking and entering as well as assault," I stated clearly. "Every second of this is being recorded, and my security system is capturing multiple angles of this entire confrontation." The men hesitated, looking to Richard for direction. He shook his head, slightly, the gesture barely perceptible but clear enough in meaning. "Stand down." Harold and the other board members physically positioned themselves between me and the Harrington contingent, a development I hadn't anticipated. Despite being part of Valerie's HOA, they seemed to have recognized the dangerous legal territory this situation had entered. "The HOA cannot be associated with trespassing or property damage," Harold announced firmly. "As acting board president, in this matter, I'm directing all Willow Creek residents to vacate this property immediately." "You don't have the authority." Valerie's voice had risen to a near shriek. "I'm the president." "You're conflicted in this matter," Harold replied calmly, "and you've potentially exposed the entire association to liability by misrepresenting your authority over this property." The siege had reached a critical inflection point. The Harringtons and their allies on one side, increasingly isolated as wedding guests and vendors began retreating to their vehicles, and Harold's faction of the HOA board on the other, attempting to minimize legal exposure. I remained where I stood, phone recording, while Amanda tried desperately to reason with her mother. "Mom, please," she begged. "Can't you see this is only making things worse? There's no wedding happening here today." "Your grandmother's ring," Valerie grasped at straws. "The family Bible for the ceremony. They're inside the barn. Morgan must have found them when we were setting up." It was a desperate, blatant lie. I had secured the barn days ago, and my security footage showed no one had accessed it since. "There are no personal items in my barn," I stated clearly, "and I have continuous security footage proving no one has accessed it this week." As if sensing his wife's increasing desperation, Richard finally took control of the situation. "We need to regroup elsewhere," he announced firmly. "Denise, contact the country club, see if they can accommodate us on short notice. Everyone else, let's move to the Willow Creek clubhouse while we sort this out." Valerie's resistance was palpable, but the tide had turned. Even her staunchest allies were retreating in the face of potential legal consequences. The siege was ending not with the dramatic confrontation Valerie had likely envisioned, but with a slow, reluctant withdrawal. As vehicles began to depart, Valerie delivered one final threat, her voice low and venomous. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." I believed her. The Harringtons were retreating, but the war for my barn had likely only entered a new phase, and the sheriff's deputies were still nowhere in sight. The Harrington contingent's retreat proceeded in fits and starts, with Valerie repeatedly attempting to rally her forces, only to be overruled by Richard and the increasingly concerned wedding planner. Vehicles departed in small groups, reluctant guests casting curious glances back at my barn as they left. Through it all, I maintained my position at the edge of my property, phone recording, a visible reminder that this was private land and not an available venue. Harold and 2 other HOA board members remained as well, apparently concerned about potential liability or further escalation. "I'm truly sorry about this," Harold offered, once most of the wedding party had departed. "The board had no idea Valerie was proceeding without your permission. She presented this as completely arranged." "I appreciate that," I replied, "but I've been fighting this for months. My attorney has sent multiple cease and desist letters to both Valerie personally and the HOA officially." Harold looked genuinely confused. "We never received any legal correspondence about this matter. Valerie handles all incoming mail for the board." This explained a great deal. Valerie had apparently been intercepting legal notices, preventing the board from learning about the dispute. The revelation added another layer to her deception. She hadn't just misled her daughter and the wedding party. She had actively hidden evidence of my refusals from her own board. The relative calm that followed the exodus was interrupted by the arrival of 2 sheriff's department vehicles, lights flashing as they pulled into my driveway. My relief at their appearance was tempered by the recognition that they were approximately 90 minutes late, long after I'd needed to take matters into my own hands. Deputies Miller and Brooks approached with the cautious professionalism of officers entering an uncertain situation. "We received a report of trespassing and attempted breaking and entering," Deputy Miller stated. "Are you Morgan Bailey, the property owner?" "Yes," I confirmed, stopping my recording and slipping my phone into my pocket. "Thank you for coming, though most of the trespassers have already left." The deputies took preliminary statements from me, Harold, and the remaining board members. I showed them my security footage of Richard attempting to cut my locks, Valerie's repeated incursions onto my property over the preceding weeks, and the evidence of wedding preparations proceeding despite my documented refusals. "This has been going on for months," I explained. "I've sent cease and desist letters, installed security cameras, and explicitly refused permission countless times. Today they arrived with a full wedding party, vendors and guests, expecting to use my barn despite never having received permission." Deputy Brooks reviewed the timeline with professional interest. "And you locked the barn from inside to prevent unauthorized access?" "Yes. After I saw Mr. Harrington approaching the doors with bolt cutters, I have interior security locks specifically designed to prevent forced entry." "Smart move," he commented. "You had every right to secure your private property, especially with evidence of attempted forced entry." Deputy Miller, meanwhile, had been speaking with Harold about the HOA's involvement. She rejoined us with a puzzled expression. "Mr. Freeman says the HOA board was under the impression that arrangements for using your barn were properly established. Apparently, Mrs. Harrington represented to the board that she had a formal agreement with you." "Completely false," I replied. "I can provide months of documentation showing my consistent refusals." The conversation paused as a silver Mercedes sped into my driveway, stopping abruptly beside the patrol cars. Valerie emerged, now accompanied by a well-dressed man carrying a leather portfolio who had not been present during the earlier confrontation. "Officers, I need to file a report immediately," she announced, approaching with confident strides. "This woman has illegally detained personal property belonging to my daughter, family heirlooms necessary for the wedding ceremony." The deputies exchanged glances, clearly recognizing they were dealing with a complicated situation. "Mrs. Harrington," Deputy Miller confirmed, "we're investigating reports of trespassing and attempted breaking and entering on this property." "Absurd," Valerie. "Dismissed. We had a clear arrangement to use the barn for my daughter's wedding." Morgan vindictively locked valuables inside after accepting payment. The man beside her stepped forward. "Ronald Whitaker, attorney for the Harrington family. My clients had a reasonable expectation of access to this venue based on prior communications and acceptance of deposit. I couldn't believe the brazen fabrication. I have never accepted any payment or given permission for any event. I have security footage showing your clients attempting to break into my barn today after months of trespassing and harassment." Deputy Brooks maintained a neutral expression. "Mr. Whitaker, do you have documentation of this alleged agreement or payment?" The attorney hesitated momentarily. "The agreement was verbal, but we have witnesses to conversations where Ms. Bailey agreed to the arrangement. The deposit was paid in cash." "Completely false," I stated firmly. "I have never received any payment, and I have documented every conversation with Mrs. Harrington, including multiple explicit refusals." The deputy's training in handling conflicting accounts was evident in their methodical approach. They separated us, taking detailed statements and reviewing evidence individually. I provided my comprehensive documentation, security footage, dated refusal letters, email correspondence, and the cease and desist notices sent by my attorney. The evidence painted a clear picture of Valerie's persistent harassment and disregard for my explicit refusals. While I couldn't hear Valerie's statement to Deputy Miller, her animated gestures and occasionally raised voice suggested the conversation wasn't proceeding as she'd hoped. The situation shifted decisively when Deputy Brooks received a radio call and stepped away briefly. Upon returning, his demeanor toward Valerie noticeably cooled. "Mrs. Harrington, we've just received information that you've filed multiple reports regarding this property over the past 3 months. Complaints about code violations, noise disturbances, and alleged commercial activity. All were investigated and found to be without merit." Valerie's composure faltered momentarily. Those were legitimate concerns about neighborhood impacts. "They appear to establish a pattern of harassment," Deputy Brooks replied evenly. "Combined with today's events and Ms. Bailey's documentation, we're seeing a concerning sequence of escalating behavior." Ronald Whitaker placed a cautioning hand on Valerie's arm, clearly sensing the direction the conversation was taking. Additionally, Deputy Brooks continued, "We've confirmed with Ms. Bailey's security company that no one has accessed the barn interior for several days, contradicting your claim about family heirlooms being locked inside." The attorney intervened smoothly. "My clients may have been mistaken about the location of certain items in the confusion of the day's events." Deputy Miller rejoined us, notepad in hand. "Based on the evidence and statements we've gathered, here's where we stand. Ms. Bailey has provided extensive documentation showing she repeatedly refused permission for any event on her property. She has clear security footage of unauthorized access attempts today, and there is no credible evidence of any agreement or payment regarding venue rental." Valerie began to protest, but Whitaker silenced her with a subtle gesture. "Mrs. Harrington," Deputy Miller continued, "you have 2 options at this point. You can leave this property immediately and cease all attempts to access it without explicit written permission from Ms. Bailey, or you can be arrested for criminal trespassing. Which would you prefer?" The ultimatum hung in the air, Valerie's expression cycling through disbelief, outrage, and finally calculated restraint, as her attorney whispered urgently in her ear. "This entire situation has been a misunderstanding," Whitaker offered smoothly. "My clients will of course respect Ms. Bailey's property rights and depart immediately." "A misunderstanding implies confusion on both sides," I noted. "There has been no confusion in my consistently expressed refusal to host this or any event." Deputy Brooks nodded in acknowledgement. "Mrs. Harrington, we're issuing a formal warning for trespassing. If you return to this property without explicit written permission from Ms. Bailey, you will be arrested. Is that understood?" Valerie's response was barely audible, her composed facade cracking under the weight of public accountability. "Yes." As The deputies escorted Valerie and her attorney back to their vehicles. Harold approached me with a troubled expression. "The HOA board will be conducting a full investigation into this matter," he assured me. Valerie's actions do not represent our community standards or values. I appreciated his sincerity, but remained skeptical after months of harassment. I hope that investigation includes the numerous false complaints filed with county officials, the fabricated legal documents sent on HOA letterhead, and the repeated boundary violations. "It will," he promised. "This has gone far beyond a simple misunderstanding." As the last vehicles finally departed and the deputies completed their report, I stood in my driveway watching the dust settle, literally and figuratively. The police intervention had finally established official recognition of what I had known all along. This was my property, my boundaries were legitimate, and no one, not even an HOA president, had the right to override my explicit refusals. But as Deputy Miller handed me a copy of the incident report, her parting words confirmed my lingering concern. "Based on the pattern we're seeing, I'd recommend staying vigilant. People who go to these lengths rarely accept defeat easily." I nodded, knowing she was right. The immediate crisis had been resolved, but the underlying conflict remained. Valerie Harrington had been forced to retreat, but her final glare as she drove away promised that the war for my barn, and perhaps my place in the community, was far from over. The aftermath of the wedding day confrontation rippled through both Willow Creek estates and the surrounding community with surprising speed. By Sunday morning, social media buzzed with conflicting accounts, the narrative splitting along predictable lines. Either I was a heartless artist who had cruelly denied a bride her special day, or I was a property owner who had rightfully defended against entitled trespassers. Valerie wasted no time launching a coordinated campaign to salvage her reputation. The Willow Creek Community Forum filled with her carefully crafted version of events. How I had verbally agreed months ago, then vindictively changed my mind at the last minute, causing her daughter irreparable emotional damage and the family significant financial loss. "The true character of our neighbors is revealed in how they support community celebrations," she wrote in a widely shared post. "Morgan Bailey has shown a disturbing lack of basic neighborly cooperation." The post accumulated supportive comments from Valerie's allies, many expressing shock at my selfish behavior and offering sympathies to poor Amanda. Several suggested organizing an HOA rule change to prevent such situations in the future, conveniently ignoring that my property remained outside their jurisdiction. Yet something unexpected happened alongside this predictable smear campaign. People began questioning Valerie's account. "Why would anyone plan an entire wedding at a venue without written confirmation?" asked one commenter. "I was there," wrote another. "The property owner had security footage of months of refusals." This wasn't a misunderstanding. Most significantly, Amanda herself broke ranks with her mother's narrative. In a brief but devastating comment, she wrote, "Mum, please stop. This wasn't Morgan's fault. You told me everything was arranged properly, when it wasn't. I'm the one who suffered, and continuing this isn't helping." This public contradiction from the supposed victim herself changed the community conversation almost overnight. People who had initially supported Valerie began reconsidering their position. Meanwhile, Harold followed through on his promise of an HOA investigation. Their findings, released the following week, were damning. Valerie had concealed legal notices, misrepresented board positions, and used HOA resources to pursue personal vendettas. The board voted unanimously to remove her as president, appointing Harold as interim leader, pending new elections. Valerie's response was a frivolous lawsuit, claiming emotional distress and financial damages. Her filing alleged I had maliciously interfered with contractual relations by refusing access to a promised venue. The demonstrably false claims might have been laughable if they hadn't required a legal response. My attorney immediately filed a motion to dismiss, attaching our extensive documentation of Valerie's trespassing, false claims, and harassment. The judge agreed, dismissing her case with prejudice and warning her attorney about filing frivolous claims without factual basis. The decisive legal victory marked a turning point, but true resolution came through unexpected channels. 3 weeks. After the failed wedding, I received an email from Amanda Harrington. "I owe you an apology," she wrote. "I should have questioned my mother's assurances about the barn. The truth is, I never even wanted a barn wedding. That was entirely her vision. My relationship with her has always been complicated, and I've struggled to establish boundaries. Watching you stand firm in defending yours was actually inspirational, though I couldn't admit that at the time." Her message concluded with a request to meet in person, neutral territory at a local coffee shop. I agreed, curious about her perspective. Our conversation proved surprisingly cathartic for both of us. Amanda described growing up under Valerie's controlling influence, where appearance and social standing always trumped personal wishes. The wedding disaster had become her breaking point. "I've started therapy to work on establishing healthier boundaries," she explained. "Something I should have done years ago." This unexpected connection helped me process my own experience. What I had interpreted as entitlement from Amanda had actually been compliance under pressure, something many of Valerie's neighbors likely understood firsthand. The broader community healing came through a town council meeting where several residents raised concerns about HOA boundary enforcement and overreach. The discussion revealed that Valerie's actions were merely the most extreme example of a pattern affecting many property owners along development boundaries. The council responded by commissioning clearer boundary markers and creating a standardized process for resolving disputes between HOA and non-HOA properties. They also established a mandatory mediation requirement before any property-related complaints could escalate to legal action. As for my barn, I eventually did open it to the community, but on my own terms. 6 months after the wedding incident, I hosted the first of what would become monthly community art classes in my studio space. The free workshops attracted participants from both sides of the property line, healing divisions that Valerie had cultivated for years. Harold attended the first session, somewhat awkwardly holding a paintbrush. "Never thought I'd be painting in the barn that caused all that trouble," he joked. "The barn didn't cause anything," I corrected gently. "People respecting or not respecting boundaries did." "Fair point," he acknowledged. "Though I have to admit, it does make a beautiful studio space, but a terrible wedding venue," I added with a smile. Valerie herself eventually moved away, selling her Willow Creek home after her position became increasingly untenable in a community where her authority had evaporated. The for sale sign appeared almost exactly 1 year after the wedding day confrontation, a fitting bookend to a saga that had begun with her refusal to accept the word no. The fundamental lesson resonated far beyond my property lines. Boundaries matter, not just for defining spaces on maps, but for structuring healthy relationships between neighbors, communities, and individuals. My barn stood as a quiet reminder that sometimes protecting what's yours isn't selfish. It's necessary. And, occasionally, it even inspires others to establish healthier boundaries of their own.